The basis of this patch is a sequence being played by the ModCan touch sequencer that controls the bass line, controls some chordal parts, and controls a little reoccurring hook melody. Like many of my patches, I'm using a dope for ribbon to control the brightness and the decay and gain of an envelope that's opening and closing our bass line. And our bass line is an audio frequency generator into a Frequensteiner filter, which really kind of cuts through everything. So as I move my finger up, I'm doing a couple things. I'm opening the filter, but I'm also simultaneously opening up the decay time on the Quadrax envelope, and I'm adding a little bit of gain on the Quadrax envelope, and we'll look at that in a moment. But the other thing that I've got going on is, in this particular version of the bass line, we're listening to constant 16th notes. But of course that gets dull fast, so we want to have some variations. So I'm using this little MTE4 mute, which is a great way to bring in some different patterns. If I press this, then now I'm not firing that envelope at all, so it's not opening up the amplifier and the filter for the bass line, but each of the different 4 buttons has a different trigger on it. And so all I've done is I've gone through the whole patch looking for different places to tap off different triggers that'll work along with the basic rhythm and tempo. So what the mute is really doing is it's allowing me to manually switch between some different trigger patterns. Okay, here comes our kick drum. The kick drum is on a little toggle switch, which is one of the few modules I was able to make on my own. And what the switch does is it switches the trigger pattern that controls our kick module. The kick drum and the snare drum are both processed by wave shapers, and as I bring the ribbon up, I'm using that same control voltage from the ribbon to open up that wave shaper a tiny little bit to make it a little bit brighter with a little bit more attack. And here's the snare drum doing something similar. For the snare drum, I'm actually using disting digital wave shaper, which adds a lot of brightness. So the snare drum gets a tiny little bit brighter. You hardly notice it. And then I've got a clap, and this is an old MFB clap module, but I'm actually processing it through one of the rare A126 dope for voltage controlled frequency shifters. And as I bring the ribbon up, you can hear the frequencies rising. I spent a lot of time on this patch tuning how the ribbon would control all these different parts. So here's kick drum, snare drum, and clap. It's also worth noting that the piece is in the key of C, but it uses a really odd scale, and the kick drum and the snare drum are tuned to that scale. So let's bring in our bass line. So now we're back to just the kick drum, and here comes our bass line. So this is full 16ths. Variation 1, variation 2, and the final variation. And then I've got a melody part which is set up on the other set of mutes. And here it is in full 16ths. Take the bass line out. So that's coming from the Modcan Touch sequencer. So what I do with the Modcan Touch sequencer is I'll create patterns of notes, but not necessarily use the same trigger patterns that I've set up in the sequencer to control it. And so here's a variation. So it's the same melody, but it's made a little bit different just by changing when it fires. And you can hear there's a little bit of portamento, a little bit of slew going on in parts of the melody, and that is directly from the Modcan, which allows you to add slew in different amounts to each note that you've programmed in. So here's with the kick drum. Throw in our snare drum. Now, interestingly, some of the patterns that I'm using for the bass line correspond with the patterns that I'm using for the melody. So I can get them to play the exact same pattern together, or I can switch it up. And with our clap. And then finally, for our little rhythm section, I've got a chordal part, and the chordal part is performed by the Modcan Touch sequencer. It's set up to control an IntelliGel shapeshifter, and the shapeshifter has a very unique function that lets you change the chord quality with an incoming voltage. So what the Modcan sequencer does is it sends a root note, and then it sends a second voltage that just calls up our chord quality. So here is the 16th note pattern from the Modcan, and you can hear the chords changing in octaves as it makes its way through the chord pattern, through the changes. And like I was saying earlier, the piece is in an interesting key. It's actually in the key of C, but the first two chords that you'll hear are a B flat minor to a D flat major, and then it resolves to a C major. So I've got different variations that I'm calling up using one of these little dope for button trigger modules. And again, it's controlled by an envelope, and that envelope opens and closes as we change the ribbon. So that's Quadrax opening its decay. So then let's have a listen to the final percussion part, which is a hi-hat. The hi-hat sound is made by a dope for A117 digital noise 808 source, and it is patched into a dope for A106-1 extreme filter. And then that goes into a double Andoric VCA, and we hear, when we bring in the hi-hat part, 2/16 on the offbeat. And the opening and the closing of the hi-hat is related to the melodies that are playing our little hook melody. And that's what gives it that sort of random opening and closing. So if we bring all this together, and then we bring in the Modcan dual delay that a lot of the brighter parts are patched into, this is what the mix is going to sound like. So that's our clap, our kick drum, one of our melody variations. And I'm slowly opening all the filters and the decays. And here comes the bass part. from the shapeshifter. So this gives me dynamic control over everything that's going on in the patch, simply by moving my finger up and down. I love this way of using a single controller to control so much of what's going on in the patch. Let's try some different variations. And here comes the snare drum. And here is the IntelliGel Quadrax. Really, the heart of this whole patch is the Quadrax and the useful way in which it can function as the central set of envelopes and function generators that are driving the whole patch. What's so great about it and makes it such an interesting module to work with is that it has 4 of these function generators built in, so it can be EGs, it can be LFOs, and a whole lot more. It'll do some really interesting outputs. But internally, it's using a matrix of CVs to control 4 different parameters, those being attack, decay, the gain of the output voltage, and the shape, which makes it such a useful module. I had really hoped to get my hands on something that would let me voltage control the shape of an AD envelope output without changing its length. Quadrax does this in spades, so much so that if you run it really fast, it makes a great LFO and audio rate oscillator. In this case, I am running 3 trigger inputs, and then I'm running 3 of the envelope outputs, and I've only got 2 CVs coming into it. Here we're listening to the bassline, and we can see in the top envelope that pulsing light is giving us an idea of the shape. As I'm increasing the ribbon now, you're seeing that light stays on longer. So that's our indication that I'm opening up the decay, but at the same time I'm also slightly increasing the gain output so that the filter is opening up higher. What's great about a module like Quadrax is because of the way that the CVs are programmed, which is a digital matrix inside the module, it allows you to take an incoming CV, like the CV from my ribbon, and then bus it to all different sorts of different places. So one CV that comes in can control all 4 parameters on all 4 of the channels, or it can control just one parameter on one channel. So it makes it a really, really useful way to set up a patch like this. The Quadrax is also being used to control the sequence from the shapeshifter chords. So this second channel is giving us the envelope for our chords. And as I open it up, you can see it start to hang open. And this light here, that red light, indicates that this channel is set to be an attack, sustain, release. So that's the bass line and the chords being opened by the Quadrax. And then finally, here's one of the melody parts. And that's right there on number 4. And it too is set up to have a sustain portion. So part of the reason that that melody part gets brighter at the same time that it's opening up is, again, one of the CVs that it's coming in has been patched internally to open up the gain of the output of the ASR envelope. This is such a great thing if you wanted to use velocity to control these, or in my case, if you want to use a controller that gives you control over multiple aspects. Also, as part of the patch, I'm using a SynthWorks fader bank, the SP-4DP, which is a great way to have remote control over parts of the patch. Once I've got a patch like this set up, I'll always set up some kind of mixer or some sort of leveling that I can grab with my left hand as I'm playing keyboards with my right hand. In this case, I'm using it to control the volume of the vocoder, the volume of the main keyboard, and the volume of the entire drone mix that we're going to talk about at the end. So getting onto the keyboard, there is a lead keyboard part that's part of this patch, which is really just me noodling over the thing for the fun of it. And once this fader is up, then it brings in that part. The keyboard patch is set up to be controlled by the ribbon. I'm using a Pittsburgh MIDI interface, a MIDI 3, a Roland MIDI keyboard, and then I'm running some oscillators through a complex network of filters and wave shapers to give it that distorted filter sound. You can also hear some phase shifting from the Dope for A-125 voltage controlled phaser, which adds that little bit of squishiness that we need for the lead part. As I bring the ribbon up, I'm opening the filter and adding a little bit of edge to it. But notice that it's not all over the place. I've spent a lot of time tuning where that range of modulation will affect the parts. That way, as I'm moving the ribbon, all of the parts are moving by the same amount, not too much or not too little. And then let's bring in some of the background parts and we'll have a listen to it. Here's our kick, one of the bass lines, there's one of the chord parts. This particular chord part on number 2 button is the backbeat, so we'll throw in the snare drum. Here's some melody, clap, the hi-hat. So now that we've got all the background parts going, if I mute out the melody, then I can play along with the lead part. And that gives us a sense of how the whole patch works. So in order to give our finished live stream a little bit of texture. It starts and ends with a drone, and the drone is totally out of sync with the rest of the patch. It's composed of 2 telharmonic modules, each set to a major chord. And a unique thing about the mode that I'm using is that the tonic is a major chord, and then the flat 2 is also a major chord. So the drone is simply a crossfade between the C major that we're hearing now, when the Dope for A134 pan module is on the left side, and then it'll pan over and crossfade, and it will give us the sound of the telharmonic that's set to a D flat major chord. And while the drone is playing, I can still play the lead keyboard, but when the keyboard fader is down on the Synthwork fader bank, what I get is a different melody patch that I've got set up that runs in the background and is patched in with the drone. That lead part is patched into the Synthwork fader bank, and it sounds like this. And it's a very distorted, reverby kind of thing. So performing with it is simply a matter of listening to the chord changes and watching the changing lights. There's a lot of reverb on this patch, very purposefully, so that as the chords change, they blend in with each other, creating a lot of tension that fades in and out as the tip-top Valhalla reverb washes in the background. I've also very purposefully allowed a certain amount of distortion across this whole drone patch. There's a little bit of flanging courtesy of a Dope for A-188 BBD module, and there's quite a bit of clipping going on in there. You may also hear a little bit of low movement, a kind of a low sequence going on, and that's a little bit of the Frequensteiner filter that's letting a tiny little bit of the bassline seep through. But the cutoff is so low you can almost barely make out what notes it's playing. And I just left it in there on purpose in the background to give a sense of the tempo that we're going to be at once I kick in the bass drum and everything else. I hope that you've enjoyed this look at my live stream patch and the kind of noodling that I do just for fun when I'm not working on something bigger and more involved. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon in the links. Thanks guys. Take care.